The shirt was Italian, hand-stitched, fitted to Choi Seo-hyun's exact measurements 6 months ago, when his body still obeyed him. Now it wouldn't button. He stood in front of the mirror in his private wing of the estate, jaw tight, yanking the fabric across his abdomen. The button slipped. Again. He exhaled slowly, the kind of exhale that precedes violence, and tried once more. Nothing. His stomach had been swelling for 8 weeks. Not fat, not bloating. Something else. Something that sat low and firm and wrong. Like a thing that had decided to grow there without his permission. He'd told no one. Not his father, Director Choi, who ran 3 criminal territories from a single phone call. Not his physician, who owed the family too many favors to stay quiet. Not the household staff, who watched everything and reported twice as much. He grabbed a looser shirt from the back of the wardrobe, buttoned it, looked at himself. The swell was still visible. He turned away from the mirror. It had started the night of Kwon Dae-soo's underground party, some rival faction's anniversary celebration that Seo-hyun had attended as a show of dominance. He remembered the drink placed in his hand by a smiling server he'd never seen before. He remembered the burn in his throat that lasted too long. He remembered thinking it was just the imported whiskey. 8 weeks later, his body was doing something he had no language for. And Choi Seo-hyun, who had never been afraid of anything in his entire life, was beginning to understand what fear actually felt like. But, before we continue, kindly hit the subscribe button and tell us where you are watching from. Zuri had learned early that invisible was safest. Not invisible in the way people romanticize, with quiet dignity or noble endurance. Invisible the way furniture is invisible, the way a clean floor is invisible. You only notice it when something goes wrong. She'd been working in the Choi estate for 14 months. She knew which hallway lights flickered, which marble tiles were uneven, which rooms were locked on Thursdays, and why. She knew the chef stole expensive wine and replaced it with cheaper bottles. She knew the head of security was sleeping with Director Choi's personal assistant. She knew things because no one watched her when she worked. That was the deal. They handed her a mop and forgot she had eyes. Today she was in the wine cellar, not because it was on her schedule but because one of the younger guards had knocked a shelf and shattered 2 bottles the night before. And apparently the mess was beneath everyone except Zuri. She worked methodically, glass swept, stain blotted, shelf wiped. It was when she pulled the shelf unit slightly away from the wall, checking for splatter, that she saw it. A small glass vial, no longer than her thumb, wedged into the gap between the shelf and the stone wall, sealed with black wax, and taped to the wall behind it, a folded slip of paper so thin it was nearly translucent. Zuri crouched, looked at it for a moment. She thought about leaving it. The Choi estate had taught her that curiosity was expensive. Then she thought about the 8 weeks she'd spent watching Seo-hyun move through the house, like a man fighting something he refused to name. The way he'd stopped wearing his fitted shirts. The way he stood at angles now, always slightly turned, like he was hiding himself from a room. She picked up the vial. She unfolded the note. The handwriting was precise, clinical, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who was proud of what they'd written. Sympathetic induction agent, Series 7. Administered, 1 exposure. Activation, 72 hours post-contact. Growth cycle, 16 to 20 weeks without intervention. The material is mine. The heir carries my legacy now. When the Choi family is ready to discuss terms, they know where to find me. The antidote window closes in 4 weeks. KB. Zuri read it twice. Then she sat down on the cellar floor. Not because she meant to, but because her legs made the decision without her. She was not a scientist. She had not studied medicine or biology or whatever branch of knowledge produced something like this. But she was not stupid, and the words on that paper arranged themselves into a meaning that was almost too grotesque to hold. Someone had put something inside Seo-hyun, deliberately, at that party, something that was growing, and whoever had done it was using it as leverage. 4 weeks. She looked at the vial in her palm. The liquid inside was colorless, faintly viscous. Completely ordinary looking, the way the most dangerous things always were. Her first instinct was to go to Director Choi. Hand it over, walk away, let the Empire handle its own monsters. But her second instinct, the quieter one, the one she'd learned to trust, told her to think. If she brought this to Director Choi, the vial disappeared into his hands. The note disappeared. And Zuri? Zuri disappeared too, one way or another. A maid who'd touched evidence in a Mafia family's war didn't get thanked. She got managed. If she said nothing, Seo Hyun had 4 weeks before whatever was growing inside him became something irreversible. She looked at the initials at the bottom of the note. KB. She folded the paper carefully, tucked it into her uniform pocket, closed her fingers around the vial. For the first time in 14 months, Zuri was no longer invisible. She was the only person in this entire estate who knew the truth, and she had no idea yet what that was going to cost her. Zuri did not sleep that night. She lay on her narrow bed in the staff quarters, staring at the ceiling, the vial wrapped in a face cloth and tucked inside her shoe. The note she'd memorized and burned over the kitchen stove at 2 a.m., holding it by one corner until the last letter turned to ash. Physical evidence was dangerous. Knowledge was harder to confiscate. She ran the initials through everything she knew. KB, the estate, had taught her names the way a battlefield taught soldiers. Fast, by necessity. Director Choi's allies, his enemies. The faction heads who smiled at dinner and sharpened knives under the table. KB. By morning, she had it. Kwanbae-jun.a. Not the faction leader himself. She'd seen Kwandae-soo at the estate twice. Older, thick-necked, the kind of man whose danger was obvious. Bae-jun was his younger brother, the quiet one, a biomedical researcher who'd allegedly left the criminal world to pursue legitimate science. Allegedly. Zuri had overheard Director Choi dismiss him once during a phone call. Bae-jun is a ghost, harmless. He makes medicines, not moves. Except Bae-jun had made exactly one move, and it was currently living inside Seo Hyun's abdomen. She pulled up what she could on the staff tablet, the one they used for household inventory, technically not restricted, but technically not meant for this. She searched carefully, deleting each query after. What she found made her sit very still. Kwon Bae-jun had published 3 academic papers before vanishing from the research community 4 years ago. The last one, retracted 6 months after publication, was titled Sympathetic Tissue Induction in Non-Gestational Hosts, a Theoretical Framework. Theoretical. Except it wasn't theoretical anymore. It was sitting in Seo Hyun's body, growing on a countdown she could feel ticking every time she blinked. 4 weeks. She closed the tablet, wiped it, put it back exactly where she found it. Then she went to make the family's breakfast, because that was what invisible women did. It was the glass of water that exposed him. Seo Hyun came down to the main dining room at 8 a.m., later than usual, moving carefully in the way he'd perfected over weeks. Small adjustments, controlled, nothing that looked like pain if you weren't watching closely. Zuri was watching closely. She was refilling the fruit display on the sideboard when he pulled out his chair and sat. She saw the exact moment his body betrayed him, a sharp intake of breath, a hand pressed flat against his abdomen beneath the table, eyes closing for just a second too long. Then he composed himself, reached for his coffee, opened his phone. Director Choi entered 4 minutes later, sat at the head of the table. The two men exchanged the clipped, functional conversation of people who respected each other too much to be warm. Business, territory. A shipment delayed out of Busan. Normal, completely normal, until Director Choi looked up from his phone and really looked at his son for the first time in what Zuri suspected was weeks. The silence lasted 3 seconds. "You've gained weight," Director Choi said. It was not a kind observation. It was the observation of a man who viewed physical changes in his heir the way he viewed cracks in a fortress wall, as structural problems requiring immediate assessment. Seo Hyun's jaw tightened. "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine, I said you've gained weight." "I heard you the first time." The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Zuri kept her eyes on the fruit display, her hands completely steady, her ears cataloging every syllable. Seo Hyun stood. The movement was slightly too deliberate. "I have calls to make." He left without finishing his coffee. Director Choi watched the empty doorway for a long moment. Then he turned, and his eyes landed on Zuri with the flat, assessing quality of a man who'd spent decades calculating what people knew. "You," his voice was calm. "Has anything seemed unusual to you recently?" Zuri looked up, blinked, let her face do the thing it had learned to do, open, mild, slightly confused. The face of a woman whose inner world was not worth investigating. "Sir?" she said, pretending she hadn't heard him before. "My son, have you noticed anything?" he asked. "He seems tired sometimes, sir. I assumed it was just work." she replied. Director Choi studied her for exactly 4 seconds. Then he looked back at his phone. That will be all. Zuri picked up her tray and walked out. Her hands were still completely steady. Her heart was doing something entirely different. She found him in the East Corridor an hour later. Not intentionally. She was changing the hallway linens, a task that required no thought and therefore left too much room for the thoughts she was trying not to have. Seo-hyun came around the corner fast, phone to his ear, mid-conversation, and nearly walked directly into her cart. He stopped, looked at her the way he always looked at her, or rather, the way he always didn't look at her, the brief, dismissive scan of a man cataloging an obstacle. Move it, he said, already looking back at his phone. Zuri shifted the cart. He stepped past, and then he stopped. She didn't know what made him stop. She would think about it later, whether it was something in her face, or the way she'd moved, or simply the terrible timing of his body choosing that exact moment to remind him it was failing. He gripped the hallway wall. Not dramatically. Not the way it happened in films. Just one hand pressed flat against the paneling, steadying himself. His phone lowering slowly from his ear. Zuri stood very still. He didn't look embarrassed. Seo-hyun was not the kind of man who did embarrassment. What crossed his face was something raw and harder to name. The expression of someone who had been fighting alone for so long that being witnessed felt like an ambush. Their eyes met, and for the first time in 14 months, Choi Seo-hyun actually looked at her, at the specific person standing in front of him, who had not looked away and had not pretended not to see. 3 seconds, then he straightened, pocketed his phone, smoothed his expression back into something unreadable. Don't mention this to anyone. It wasn't a request. Zuri held his gaze for 1 beat longer than was appropriate for a maid speaking to the director's son. I never do, she said quietly. Something shifted in his face, too small to name, gone before she could examine it. He walked away. Zuri turned back to the linen cart, her pulse loud in her ears, the vial still wrapped in its face cloth, still hidden, still ticking. She had 4 weeks. And Choi Seo-hyun had just looked at her like she was a person. That was either the beginning of something, or the most dangerous thing that had happened to her yet. There was one person Zuri trusted outside the estate walls. Not a friend, exactly. Friendship was a luxury that domestic work in a criminal household didn't accommodate. But Saifo Dlamini was the closest thing she had. A South African, Zulu medical courier who delivered pharmaceutical supplies to the estate's private clinic twice a month. They'd built something over 14 months that existed entirely in the 15 minutes he spent signing inventory, and she spent checking deliveries against the manifest. Small talk, shared silences, the particular ease of 2 people from the continent who understood, without discussing it, what it meant to be the only one in the room. She called him from the staff bathroom at 11 p.m., one earbud in, water running. I need you to find someone, she said when he picked up. Quietly, Dlamini was silent for a moment. Zuri, what kind of someone? A researcher, biomedical. He disappeared from academic circles 4 years ago. His name is Kwon Bae-jun. She paused. He may be operating a private lab, somewhere close enough to monitor the estate but far enough to feel safe. Another silence. Longer this time. What did you find? Dlamini said. Not a question. Something that can't wait, and something I can't hand to the family without it disappearing along with me. She heard him exhale slowly, the sound of a man weighing loyalty against survival, which was a calculation she understood intimately. Give me 72 hours, he said finally. I have less than 4 weeks total. 72 hours is fine. She hung up, turned off the tap, looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment, at the woman who had crossed, in one phone call, from witness to participant. There was no crossing back. She dried her hands and went to bed. It happened on a Wednesday. Zuri was in the Upper East Wing, rotating the artwork. A monthly task that existed purely because Director Choi believed static display bred complacency. When she heard the sound, not a crash, not a shout, something worse, a single controlled grunt of pain from behind Seo-hyun's closed bedroom door, followed by absolute silence. The silence was the alarming part. She set down the painting, stood outside his door, knocked twice. The staff knock, short and functional, nothing. She knocked again. I said I don't need anything. His voice was tight, compressed, the voice of a man using significant energy to sound normal. I haven't said anything yet, sir, she said. There was a pause. Then don't, he responded. Zuri put her hand flat on the door, I can hear that you're in pain. I'm not going to pretend I can't. The silence that followed was the longest 15 seconds of her recent life. Then the lock clicked. She pushed the door open. Seo-hyun was seated on the edge of his bed, one arm braced behind him, the other pressed across his abdomen. His shirt was untucked. His face was the color of old marble, not pale but drained of whatever warmth usually lived there. The swell beneath his shirt was more pronounced than it had been even 3 days ago. He looked at her with an expression that contained equal parts fury and exhaustion. If you say a single word about this to anyone in this house, I won't. She stepped inside, closed the door behind her. How long has it been this bad? He said nothing. The pain, she clarified. How long? 2 days. The admission seemed to cost him something. It moves. Zuri went very still. It moves, like pressure, shifting. His jaw tightened. I don't need your reaction. I need it to stop. She crossed the room and crouched in front of him, not touching, just looking, at the contour of the swelling, the way it sat, the slight asymmetry that hadn't been there last week. It was accelerating. 4 weeks had just become a more urgent number. You need a doctor, she said. I've had 3 doctors. None of them found anything they could name. He replied. Not that kind of doctor. She held his gaze. A different kind. Something sharpened in his eyes. What do you know? It wasn't a question. It was an accusation dressed as one. The instinct of a man trained from birth to identify when someone in front of him was holding information. Zuri stood. Rest, she said. I'll bring something for the pain. She walked to the door. Zuri, he called. She stopped. He'd never used her name before. She was certain of it. In 14 months she had been the maid, or you, or nothing at all. She turned. His eyes were locked on her. Sharp, dark, searching. The eyes of his father wearing a younger face. What do you know? He said again. Quieter this time. Which made it more dangerous. She held his gaze for exactly long enough. Rest, Seo-hyun. She used his name deliberately, without the honorific, without the distance, and she left before he could decide what to do about it. He came to find her that evening. She was in the kitchen, garden, a narrow strip of herbs behind the east wing that nobody used except the chef, and apparently Zuri, who had spent the last 6 months quietly tending the neglected half of it because growing things was the only act in this house that felt entirely hers. She heard his footsteps on the stone path before she saw him, slower than his usual pace, more deliberate. He stopped at the garden entrance, looked at her kneeling in the soil, then at the garden itself, as if he hadn't known it existed. Which he probably hadn't. You fix this, he said. The other half was dying. She didn't look up. It seemed wasteful. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped inside the garden and sat on the low stone bench near the wall, not gracefully but with the careful economy of a man managing discomfort. For a while neither of them spoke. The evening was warm. Somewhere beyond the estate walls, the city moved and breathed and had no idea what was happening inside this house. I went to Kwon Dae-soo's party, Seo-hyun said finally. 4 months ago. Someone handed me a drink. Zuri kept her hands in the soil. I didn't think anything of it. You don't think about drinks at parties. A pause. You think about who gave it to you afterward. When it's too late to matter. She sat back on her heels, looked at him properly for the first time since the bedroom. He looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The kind of exhaustion that came from carrying something alone for so long that the weight had become structural. Part of how you stood, how you breathed, how you moved through rooms. She understood that exhaustion. Intimately. There was a vial, she said, and a note. The air between them changed. He didn't move, didn't blink. Every trained instinct in him went completely still, the way a predator went still, not from fear, but from focus. Where? He asked, his tone curious. Wine cellar, behind the north shelf, 6 weeks ago. She responded. 6 weeks. Something moved across his face. You've known for 6 weeks. Yes. And you said nothing. I'm saying something now. The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded. With his anger, with her calculation, with everything that existed in the space between a man who had power and a woman who had information, and the strange temporary equality that created. The note had a name, she continued. Kwon Bae-jun, and a deadline. She met his eyes. You have less than 4 weeks before whatever is inside you becomes something that can't be reversed. He stared at her. She watched him process it. watched the Mafia boss's son absorb the specific horror of his situation with the same controlled stillness he'd probably applied to every crisis in his adult life. No panic, no explosion, just the slow, terrible recalibration of a man who now understood exactly what he was dealing with. "The vial," he said. "I have it," she replied. "Give it to me," he said. "No," the word landed cleanly, no apology attached to it. His eyes narrowed. "You're telling me you have the only physical evidence of what was done to me, and you're refusing. If I give it to you, it goes to your father. Your father's men go after Beijun. Beijun destroys the antidote before they reach him, because that's what someone who planned this carefully does when they feel threatened." She held his gaze. "And then you have nothing, and I have nothing, and the clock runs out." The silence stretched between them. "I have a contact," she said, "finding Beijun's location. Not through force, through information. We will find the lab first, then we move." Seo-hyun looked at her for a long time. She could not fully read what was happening behind his eyes. She suspected no one could, most of the time. "We," he repeated. "We," she confirmed. The word sat between them like a door neither of them had expected to find. He looked away. At the garden, at the herbs she'd brought back from dying, at the careful order she'd built in a small neglected space nobody else had bothered with. When he looked back, something in his face had shifted. Subtle. But there. "You have 72 hours," he said. "Then we do this my way." It was not gratitude. It was not warmth. It was a negotiation conducted between two people who were, for reasons neither of them had chosen, now on the same side. But it was the first time in 14 months that Choi Seo-hyun had sat down in her space and treated the ground beneath her as worth sitting on. Sifo called at 6:47 a.m. on the third day. Zuri was already awake. She hadn't slept past 5 a.m. in 2 weeks. She picked up before the second ring, slipping out of the staff quarters and into the narrow utility corridor that ran behind the kitchen. "I found him," Sifo said. No greeting, no preamble. That was how she knew it was serious. "Where?" "Industrial district, 40 minutes south of the estate. He's running a private lab inside a decommissioned pharmaceutical plant. Registered under a shell company. Utilities paid 18 months in advance." A pause. "Zuri, this wasn't improvised. He set this up long before the party, before Seo-hyun even walked through that door. The cold that moved through her had nothing to do with the corridor temperature." "How contained is the location?" she asked. "That's the problem." Sifo's voice dropped slightly. "The building has 2 access points, both monitored. He has 4 men on rotation, not scientists, not security contractors. These are Kwan Dae-soo's soldiers. The elder brother is backing this fully." Another pause. "And there's something else." She waited. "There's a second vial registered in the lab inventory. I got partial access to a digital manifest through a contact inside the supply chain." His exhale was slow and careful. "The antidote exists, Zuri. It's there. But the manifest logs show it was moved 3 days ago to a secondary location within the building. Somewhere not on the original blueprints. A room that didn't officially exist. Inside a building that officially wasn't a lab." "He knew someone would come," she said. "He planned for it. The whole setup reads like a welcome mat over a pit." Sifo paused one final time. "I can get you the blueprints by tonight, but whatever you're planning, you need to move fast and you need to move clean. Because if Kwan Beijun feels any pressure at all before you reach that antidote, he destroys it," Zuri finished. "Gone. Along with any proof of what he did." She pressed her back against the utility wall. Above her, the estate was beginning its morning sounds. Footsteps, kitchen noise, the distant murmur of Director Choi's early calls. 40 minutes south, 4 soldiers, a hidden room, 3 weeks left on the clock. "Send me the blueprints," she said. Tonight. She hung up, stood in the dark corridor for exactly 30 seconds, letting the full weight of it settle. Then she straightened, smoothed her uniform, and went to start the morning rounds. Because Zuri had learned something important in 14 months of invisibility. The most dangerous thing you could do in a house like this was look like you were thinking. Director Choi called his son into the study at noon. Zuri knew because she was replacing the hallway flowers 12 feet from the study door, and the Choi estate had been built in an era when walls were decorative rather than soundproof. She worked slowly, methodically, her ears open. "Sit down," Director Choi's voice, the one that didn't negotiate. A chair creaked and silence followed. "I've had Dr. Shin watching you for 2 weeks." Zuri's hands paused on the flower stems. Resumed. "You didn't tell me you were ill." Not an accusation, something colder. A verdict. I'm handling it. Seo Hyun's voice went flat and controlled. You are not handling it. You are hiding it, which is a different thing entirely and significantly more dangerous. The sound of a desk drawer, papers. Dr. Shin believes the tissue growth is organic but foreign. He wants to operate. No, Seo Hyun. I said no. A pause. Operating blind removes nothing. It accelerates whatever process is already running. Shin doesn't know what he's looking at because he hasn't seen anything like it, which means cutting into it without the right information could kill me faster than leaving it alone. Silence from the director. The particular silence of a man recalculating. Then tell me what you do know, he said finally. The pause that followed was 3 seconds long. Zuri counted them. I know who did it, Seo Hyun said, and I know where the antidote is. Give me 1 week. You have 4 days. Director Choi's voice left no room. After 4 days, I move my own people in and we handle this the way this family handles things. With or without your cooperation. The way this family handled things. Zuri knew exactly what that meant. Kwon Bae-jun would be found. The lab would be torn apart. And in the chaos of a Mafia extraction, the antidote, sitting in a hidden room inside a building rigged for exactly this kind of pressure, would be gone before anyone's hands reached it. 4 days. She pulled the last dead stem from the arrangement, gathered her things, and walked calmly down the hallway. She needed to find Seo Hyun before Director Choi's men started watching him. She left a single sprig of rosemary outside his bedroom door. It was the only signal they had, established in 30 seconds during a conversation in the kitchen garden 3 days ago, when Seo Hyun had looked at her and said, with the blunt pragmatism of a man who'd grown up in a world of codes, if you need to reach me without being seen, make it something ordinary, something that belongs in a hallway. 40 minutes later. The same wine cellar, the same stone walls, full circle, in a way that neither of them acknowledged because there wasn't time. Zuri spread Saifo's blueprints on the top of a barrel. Seo Hyun stood across from her, close enough that she could see the controlled tension he was carrying in his shoulders. The permanent brace of a man whose body had become enemy territory. She walked him through it cleanly. The location, the shell company, the 4 soldiers on rotation, the secondary hidden room where the antidote had been moved. He listened without interrupting, which she was learning was his way. Absolute stillness when information mattered. Absolute precision when he finally spoke. He moved the antidote 3 days ago, he said. Yes, she responded. 3 days ago is when I told my father I needed 1 week. His eyes met hers. Bae-jun has someone inside this estate. The realization landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. Not just a rival's scheme. A surveillance operation. Someone within the Choi household was feeding information to Kwon Bae-jun, which meant the moment Director Choi's men mobilized. Bae-jun would know. The antidote would be destroyed before a single soldier crossed the building threshold. We would go in without your father's knowledge, Zuri said. 2 people. No advanced signal, nothing that can be leaked. Seo Hyun looked at her steadily. You and me. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him run the calculation. The risk, the variables, the alternative, which was his father's men arriving 4 days from now to find an empty hidden room and a destroyed antidote. I can get us past the outer surveillance, he said finally. I know Kwon Dae-soo's patrol patterns. We used to use the same security contractor. A pause. The hidden room is the problem. If it's not on the blueprints, we find it by elimination, which costs time we don't have inside the building. Saifo thinks it's below the Eastern Laboratory. She pointed at the blueprint. Here, the foundation's deeper on this side than the structural plans justify. A sublevel. Small, maybe 2 rooms. Seo Hyun studied the blueprint. His finger traced the eastern wall. Stopped. There's a ventilation shaft on this side, he said quietly. Old pharmaceutical plants ran climate-controlled sublevels for compound storage. If the room exists, it'll connect to this system. He looked up. We would go in through the ventilation access on the building's north face, bypass the entry points entirely. Zuri looked at him. In another life, a life where she was not a maid and he was not a mafia boss's son, and none of this was happening. She thought Choi Seo-hyun might have been extraordinary at something else entirely. The way his mind moved. Clean, fast, completely without waste. Tomorrow night, she said. Tomorrow night, he straightened, began folding the blueprint. With the same precision he applied to everything. Then he stopped. He didn't look up. He just stopped folding for a single moment, his hands still on the paper. "Why are you doing this?" he said, quietly, genuinely. The question of a man who had spent his whole life in a world where nobody did anything without a reason, and couldn't locate hers. Zuri took the blueprint from his hands, finished folding it herself. "Because it needed doing," she said, "and I was the only one who knew." She tucked it into her uniform pocket and walked to the cellar stairs. Behind her, the silence he left was different from his usual silences. This one had something in it she hadn't heard from him before. She didn't turn around to examine it. Tomorrow night there will be enough time to survive first. They left at 1 a.m., no uniforms, no estate vehicles. Seo Hyun had pulled 2 sets of dark civilian clothes from a bag she hadn't seen him pack, which told her he'd done this kind of thing before, moved through the night as someone other than who he was. She didn't ask. Some knowledge was safer as inference. Sifo had arranged a car, parked 3 blocks from the estate service entrance, keys under the left rear wheel, plates clean. When Zuri relayed this, Seo Hyun had looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. The slight recalibration of a man who kept discovering she was more prepared than he'd assumed. He drove. She navigated. The city moved past the windows in amber and shadow, indifferent and enormous. 40 minutes felt like 10. The pharmaceutical plant materialized out of the industrial dark. A wide, low building behind chain-link fencing. No signage. Lights on only in the eastern section. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it claimed to be. Abandoned. Forgotten. The kind of building a city produced in bulk and remembered only when something went wrong inside it. Seo Hyun cut the engine 2 streets away. They sat for a moment in the dark. "Patrol rotation," he said quietly. 8 minutes between sweeps on the north face. We have a 4-minute window inside the rotation to reach the ventilation access. He checked his watch. "We move in 90 seconds. Zuri pulled the vial from her jacket's interior pocket. The colorless liquid caught what little light existed and held it. "What is that for?" Seo Hyun said. "Sifo thinks it's a partial compound, possibly a locator agent, something Beijun could use to track the growth remotely." She tucked it back. "If we find the antidote, this might tell us whether the formula is complete or whether he has components stored separately." Seo Hyun stared at her. "You worked that out yourself." "Sifo worked it out, I just carried it." Zuri, she looked at him, in the dark of the car, with the city quiet outside and 40 minutes of road behind them. His face was stripped of its usual architecture, the arrogance, the control, the performative invulnerability of a man who'd grown up proving himself inside a dynasty. What was left was just a person, tired and afraid in the specific way that people were afraid when they couldn't afford to show it. "If something goes wrong in there," he said, "nothing will go wrong," she assured him. "If it does." "Seo Hyun." Her voice was steady and quiet. "I found the vial. I found Beijun. I found Seifo's contact inside the supply chain. I have been 3 steps ahead of this situation since the moment I pulled that note off your wine cellar wall." She held his gaze. "Trust me the way I've trusted you tonight, by getting in this car." The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then something in him settled. Not collapsed, not surrendered, but the way a foundation settled when it finally accepted the weight it was built to hold. 90 seconds, he said. "I know, I'm counting." They moved. The ventilation access was exactly where Seifo's blueprint said it would be. A rusted grate on the building's north face, 3 feet off the ground, half hidden behind a collapsed equipment shelter that had probably been left there specifically to make the access look impassable. Seo Hyun had the grate off in 40 seconds. Hinges already loosened, she realized, which meant he'd sent someone ahead earlier without telling her. She filed that away without commenting on it. The shaft was narrow, dark, warm in the particular way of enclosed spaces that moved air from somewhere living. She went first. He followed. The sound of the city disappeared completely. They moved through the shaft in silence, Zuri navigating by the blueprint she'd memorized, rather than a light that could be seen. Left at the first junction, straight through the long, central run, down the angled section where the shaft dropped toward the foundation. Then she heard it. Voices, below and ahead. 2 of them speaking Korean in the clipped, functional shorthand of men who worked together closely, enough to have abandoned full sentences. She stopped. Seo Hyun's hand touched her ankle. He'd heard it too. They waited. The voices faded. Footsteps echoed. A door creaked open, then closed. Then nothing but silence. She exhaled and kept moving. The sublevel access was a drop hatch. A square panel in the shaft floor that opened onto a metal ladder descending into cool, climate-controlled air. Exactly as Saifo had predicted. She eased it open by centimeters, checking below, then dropped down. Seo Hyun landed beside her a moment later. She turned. The sublevel was 2 rooms, as Saifo had estimated. The first was a monitoring space. Screens, equipment, data she didn't have time to process. The second was visible through a reinforced glass panel set into the connecting wall. Inside it, on a climate-controlled shelf running the full length of the room, were compounds. Vials. Sealed containers in organized rows. And at the far end of the shelf, separated from the others, a single sealed unit with a biometric lock and a label she couldn't read from here. That's it, Seo Hyun said quietly beside her. That has to be it. They moved toward the connecting door, and then Seo Hyun stopped walking. Things she'd remember later. How undramatic it was. No warning, no escalating signs. One moment he was beside her, reaching for the door handle, and the next his hand missed the handle entirely and he was going down. One knee hitting the concrete floor, then both hands, head dropping, a sound leaving him that she had never heard from him before and hoped never to again. Low, involuntary, the sound of a body hitting its absolute limit. Seo Hyun. She was beside him instantly, one hand on his back, the other on his shoulder. Hey, look at me. His breathing was wrong, too shallow, too fast, catching on something internal. His hand was pressed hard against his abdomen, and beneath her palm she felt what he'd described days ago. Movement. The terrible, wrongful shifting of something that had no business being there. It was accelerating. The stress of the mission, the physical exertion. Something had triggered a surge. His face was the color of the concrete floor. Leave me. His voice was barely above a breath. Get the antidote, I'll... Stop talking. She got an arm under his and pulled him upright against the wall, taking more of his weight than she expected. He was heavier than he looked, dense with the kind of muscle that came from a life that required it. She got him seated, back against the wall, legs out. His eyes found hers. Dark, blown wide with pain, stripped of every layer he'd ever put between himself and the world. I can't walk, he said. Simply. As a fact. You don't need to walk yet. She held his gaze, keeping her voice even, keeping her face calm the way she'd kept it calm through 14 months of this household's indignities. I need 3 minutes. Can you give me 3 minutes? Something crossed his face. The ghost of something almost like disbelief, like he might have laughed, though it never fully formed. 3 minutes, he said. She stood, turned to the connecting door. Biometric lock on the other side. But a standard panel lock on this side, which Baejun had apparently not considered worth upgrading because the sublevel itself was the security. She had it open in 40 seconds, using a method Saifo had described over the phone, and she'd practiced on the estate's wine cellar lock for 3 nights running. She pushed inside. The climate-controlled air hit her like a held breath finally released. She moved down the shelf fast, reading labels, discarding, reading, her hands steady, her mind running clean the way it only ran when there was no room for anything except the next necessary thing. There, the sealed biometric unit at the end of the shelf. Up close the label was clear, SIAS-7 reversal compound. Single use. Full neutralization, 98.7%. The biometric lock required a fingerprint. Baejun's fingerprint, which she did not have. She stared at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then she pulled the original vial from her pocket, the one from the wine cellar, the partial compound Saifo had identified. She looked at it, looked at the lock panel, looked at the faint input port on the lock's underside, designed for a secondary access method in case of biometric failure, a compound input port. For verification by chemical signature rather than fingerprint, a backup designed for laboratory conditions, where gloves made fingerprint access unreliable. Baejun was a scientist first. He'd built himself a secondary door. She inserted the vial's tip into the port. 1 second, 2. The lock released with a sound like a quiet, definitive exhale. She took the antidote. She was back through the connecting door in 90 seconds. Seo Hyun was exactly where she'd left him. Against the wall, one hand still pressed to his abdomen, his eyes closed. They opened the moment he heard her footsteps. She crouched in front of him, held up the sealed unit. He looked at it, then at her, then back at it. He said nothing. There were no words in whatever was moving across his face in that moment. No category in his vocabulary for what she'd just done. or for the fact that she'd done it while he sat on a concrete floor and couldn't stand. She opened the seal carefully. Checked the application method, subcutaneous injection, left side. She looked at him. "This is going to work," she said. Not a reassurance, a statement. He pulled up the left side of his shirt without being asked. Her hands did not shake. She administered it cleanly. He made no sound. His jaw was set and his eyes were open, and he watched her face the entire time with an expression she had no name for, and didn't try to find one. She withdrew, resealed what she could, sat back on her heels. "How long?" he said. "CFO said effects within 20 minutes, full reversal over 72 hours. He nodded slowly. Then he let his head fall back against the wall, eyes closing, and for the first time in what she suspected was months, the tension that lived permanently across his shoulders simply released, like a man who had finally been allowed to put something down. They had perhaps 6 minutes before the patrol rotation brought soldiers to the north face. But for 30 seconds, in a hidden room inside a building that didn't officially exist, Zuri sat on the floor beside Choi Seo-hyun, and neither of them said anything at all. She had found him in the dark. She had not left him there. And somewhere in the quiet of those 30 seconds, that became the truest thing between them, more honest than anything either of them might have said with words. Then she stood, put her hand out. He looked at her hand for a moment. Then he took it. She pulled him to his feet. He was steadier than she expected. Or maybe he was pulling himself up and just using her hand as the reason he could. She didn't distinguish between the two. It didn't matter. "Can you move?" she asked. "Yes, then let's go home." They climbed back into the dark together. Nobody stopped them. The patrol rotation came around the north face 40 seconds after they cleared the fence. She heard boots on gravel as she pulled the car door shut and sat completely still in the passenger seat, while Seo-hyun started the engine with the unhurried precision of a man who understood that speed attracted attention, and stillness did not. He pulled out slowly. 1 street, 2, 3, then they were in traffic, and the plant was behind them, and the city swallowed them whole the way cities did. Indifferent, enormous, mercifully blind. Neither of them spoke for 10 minutes. Zuri watched the streetlights move across the windshield in long amber strokes. Her hands were in her lap, completely still. The steadiness that had carried her through the sublevel, through the lock, through the injection, all of it still holding, the way adrenaline held things together until it decided not to. She was aware, distantly, that she would feel this later. That the full weight of tonight would find her eventually, probably at 3 a.m. in the staff quarters, probably while staring at the same ceiling she'd been staring at for 14 months. But not yet. "Your contact," Seo-hyun said finally. "Sifo. Yes. The supply chain access, the blueprints, the compound analysis." A pause. "He did all of that in 72 hours. He's resourceful. He's more than resourceful." His eyes stayed on the road. "Who is he actually?" Zuri considered the question. "Someone who helps people who need it, without asking for more than they can give." Seo-hyun was quiet for a moment. "I want to compensate him. He won't take money from your family," Zuri said. "Then what will he take?" She looked at his profile in the dark, the jaw that was always set, the eyes that were always calculating, the hands on the wheel that were, she noticed, slightly less rigid than they'd been an hour ago, the antidote already moving through him, beginning its quiet work of reversal. "His cousin is in a detention situation," she said. "Immigration, been waiting 14 months for a resolution that keeps not coming." She paused. A single phone call from the right person would end it. Seo-hyun said nothing. Then, "Consider it done." Zuri turned back to the windshield. She had not expected that. She had not expected it to be that simple, or that fast, or delivered with that complete absence of theater. No negotiation, no extraction of something in return. Just, "Consider it done." She filed it beside the other things she was collecting about Choi Seo-hyun, the things that didn't fit the shape she'd been given of him. They were 20 minutes from the estate when his phone lit up. He glanced at it. His expression didn't change, but something in the quality of his stillness did, the way the air in a room changed when a door opened somewhere distant. He declined the call. It rang again immediately. He declined it again. "Who is it?" Zuri asked. There was a pause. "My father." The cold that moved through her was different from the one in the corridor that morning. Sharper. More specific. "He knows," she said. "He knows." Seo-hyun's voice was completely even. He's known since we left, which means the mole moved fast. The mole moved the moment we walked out the service entrance. His jaw tightened, the first crack in his composure since the sub-level floor. Someone in that house has been watching me for months and reporting every movement, and tonight they finally had something worth reporting. Zuri thought about the wine cellar, the note, the 6 weeks she'd spent carrying this alone. They didn't report the vial, she said slowly. If they'd been watching you that closely, they would have seen me find it. They would have told Bae-jun immediately. Seo-hyun's hands shifted on the wheel. She watched the realization move through him. They didn't know you found it, he said. Which means they've been watching me, not the staff. Someone close to you specifically. Not a general household observer. The silence that followed was the kind that reorganized things. She watched him run through names behind his eyes, people in his orbit, people with access, people who had been present across 4 months of his deterioration. His phone lit up a third time. This time he answered. I'm 20 minutes out. His voice in the phone was not the voice he used with her. It was flatter, older somehow. The voice of a son inside a dynasty. Yes, both of us. There was a pause, listening. Father. The single word precisely placed, like a hand pressed flat against a door. 20 minutes, he hung up. Zuri looked straight ahead. How bad? He's not angry, Seo-hyun said. She knew enough about Director Choi to understand that this was the worst possible answer. Director Choi was in the main study when they arrived. No guards outside the door. Which meant the guards were elsewhere, positioned, which was more deliberate than having them visible. The room was lit by a single lamp. He was seated behind his desk, reading glasses on, a document open in front of him that Zuri was certain he was not actually reading. He looked up when they entered. His eyes moved from his son to Zuri, stayed on Zuri. The specific way that made people underestimate the interior it was protecting. Close the door, Director Choi said. Seo-hyun closed it. Sit. I'll stand, Seo-hyun said. Something moved in the director's expression. Too controlled to be annoyance, too precise to be anything unconscious. The girl, he said. Not to Seo-hyun, to Zuri directly. You found evidence in my house 6 weeks ago and told no one. I told your son, Zuri said. You told my son 3 weeks after finding it. Yes. Why? She held his gaze. This was the moment, the exact fulcrum on which the next version of her life would balance. She knew it the way she knew the patrol rotation, the way she knew the blueprint, the way she knew which truths to hold and which to release and precisely when. Because the evidence would have disappeared into your hands, she said, and the antidote would have been destroyed before your men reached the lab, and your son would have had nothing. The silence was absolute. Director Choi looked at her for a very long time, the look of a man running a full assessment. Not of her threat level, but of her quality, the particular, rare attention he probably gave to very few people. You went into a Quan-controlled facility, he said. 2 people. No backup. No weapons beyond what I assume was a great deal of preparation. He removed his glasses. Set them down. And you came back with the antidote. Yes. And my son is alive and standing. Yes. Another silence. You could have come to me at any point in the last 3 weeks, he said. After you told Seo-hyun. You had his ear. You had information I needed. You chose to operate independently inside my house, using my staff resources, running an extraction mission without my knowledge or sanction. His voice was perfectly level, perfectly calm. In my world, that is an act requiring significant justification. Zuri didn't flinch. In your world, I would have been managed. The evidence would have been taken, and I would have been removed from the situation, cleanly, quietly, the way your world removes things it finds inconvenient. And your son would have died on a timeline that your doctors couldn't stop because they didn't know what they were stopping. She paused. I made the calculation that kept him alive. I stand by it. The room breathed. Seo-hyun beside her said nothing. She was aware of him the way she was aware of weather, the particular atmospheric pressure of a person standing very still and waiting to move. Director Choi looked at his son. She speaks for herself well. She does everything well, Seo-hyun said quietly. That's been true for 14 months. We chose not to notice. Director Choi looked between them, the precise, unhurried look of a man who had built an empire on reading people accurately, and had just read something that required updating several assumptions simultaneously. He put his glasses back on, looked at the document on his desk. The mole, he said. My head of scheduling, he's been handled. The Kwan brothers will be addressed through appropriate channels beginning tomorrow. Another pause. The girl's contract will be revised to reflect her current role more accurately. Zuri blinked. Sir, you are no longer employed as a maid in this household. Director Choi turned a page without looking up. What you are employed as will require some consideration, but it will not be that. He glanced up once briefly. You may go, she went, or she started to. Zuri, Seo-hyun's voice came from behind her. She stopped and turned around. He was still standing in the center of the study. His father was already back to his document, or the performance of it. The lamp cast everything in amber. Seo-hyun looked at her across the room with an expression she had been collecting pieces of for weeks, and was only now, in this light, able to see assembled. Thank you, he said. 2 words. Simple. Unadorned. From a man who she suspected said them to almost no one. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the nod of a person receiving something real, and walked out. The reversal took exactly what Saipho had predicted. 72 hours. 3 days of Seo-hyun moving through the estate differently, lighter somehow, as if the weight had been not just physical but atmospheric. She passed him in hallways. He looked at her each time. On the second day, Zuri found a tray outside her staff quarters door. Not food, a phone. New, clean, a number already saved under a single initial. S. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands, thought about 14 months of invisibility, of learning to make herself furniture, of the garden she'd grown in a neglected strip of soil because it was the only act in the house that felt entirely hers. She put the phone in her pocket. On the 3rd morning, she was in the kitchen garden when she heard footsteps she recognized. Deliberate, measured, the walk of a man who had spent his life entering rooms as if he owned them, and was only now learning there were spaces that required a different approach. He stopped at the garden entrance, looked at her, at the herbs, at the careful living order of it all. The swelling is gone, he said. I know. I can tell by how you walk. She responded. He almost smiled. Anything she'd seen before. He stepped inside the garden, sat on the low stone bench, not with the careful management of pain that had defined every movement for months. Just sat, like a person who was allowed to simply be somewhere. The morning was warm, the city beyond the walls moved in its enormous, indifferent way. My father is creating a position, he said, formally, within the household's administrative structure. A pause. It will have appropriate authority, appropriate access. Another pause, smaller. Appropriate proximity. Zuri kept her hands in the soil. He's doing that, she said. Or you asked him to? The almost smile came back. Got slightly further this time. Does it matter, he said. She sat back on her heels, looked at him properly, at this man who had looked through her for 14 months and was now sitting in the garden she'd grown and asking her questions that had no armor in them. Seo-hyun. Yes. The next time you are in trouble. She held his gaze. Tell someone. He looked at her. Something shifted behind his eyes. The specific, quiet shift of a person hearing something they needed and hadn't known how to ask for. The next time I'm in trouble, he said slowly, I'll tell you. The distinction was deliberate. She heard it clearly. She turned back to the garden, pressed her hands into the warm soil. The herbs were thriving, the ones she'd brought back from dying, the ones she'd tended in the margins of a life that hadn't left much room for tending. Then I'll be here, she said. The phone call came at 7 a.m. Seo-hyun was in his office, actually working for the first time in months, the kind of focused, uninterrupted work that a body in pain couldn't sustain, when his father walked in without knocking. Director Choi never knocked. Knocking implied the possibility of being told to wait, and there was no door in this estate that would tell him that. He placed a single photograph on the desk. Seo-hyun looked at it. Kwon Bae-jun, taken within the last 12 hours. Grainy, surveillance quality, but clear enough. He was at an airport. Carry-on bag, boarding pass visible in his left hand. He's running, Seo-hyun said. He ran the moment the lab's internal sensors logged an unauthorized access to the sub-level. Director Choi's voice was completely level. His security team swept the building at 4 a.m., found the open biometric unit, the missing compound. A pause. He knows the antidote is gone. He knows someone got inside, and he's calculated, correctly, that the window for his leverage has closed. Seo-hyun looked at the boarding pass in the photograph, squinted. That flight doesn't leave until noon, he said. Director Choi looked at his son. The look of a man who had already made several decisions and was now offering his son the courtesy of catching up. No, he said. It doesn't. Zuri found out at 8 a.m. the way she found out most things in this house, by being somewhere nobody thought to account for. She was in the upper corridor, habit, routine, the muscle memory of 14 months, when she heard Seo Hyun's voice from behind his office door. Controlled but moving fast, the way his voice moved when he was coordinating rather than conversing. Then a name, Bae-jun. She stopped, put her tray down on the hallway console, stood very still. She caught fragments, airport, noon, 2 teams. Then Seo Hyun's voice dropping into something she hadn't heard from him before, not the cold directorial tone he used with staff, not the clipped efficiency he used with his father. Something older, harder. I want him brought in conscious. Whatever condition he arrives in, he needs to be able to talk. She picked her tray back up, walked to the kitchen, set it down, stood at the counter with her hands flat on the surface, and thought very carefully about what she was going to do next. Because there was something Director Choi didn't know. Something she hadn't said in the study the night before because it hadn't felt necessary then. The compound port on the biometric lock. The secondary access she'd used to retrieve the antidote had accepted the original vial, which meant the vial's chemical signature was registered in Bae-jun's system as an authorized access key, which meant if Bae-jun's team ran a full forensic sweep of the sublevel, they wouldn't find evidence of a break-in. They'd find evidence of an inside access. Someone with authorized credentials. Someone Bae-jun would spend the rest of his running hours trying to identify. Someone who, if Bae-jun was brought in and talked before that detail was understood and controlled, could be traced back to a maid in the Choi household who was currently standing in a kitchen with her hands flat on a counter and no official protection whatsoever. She needed to be in that room when they brought him in, not as staff, not as a witness, as the person who understood exactly what he'd built and exactly how it had been dismantled, because she was the only one who did. She picked up the new phone from her pocket, opened it to the single saved contact, typed, I need to be there when they bring him in. Don't tell your father. She watched the screen. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, East Garage, 20 minutes. She put the phone away, untied her apron, folded it neatly over the counter edge, and walked out of the kitchen for what she understood, without ceremony, was the last time she would walk out of it as the person who cleaned up after other people's messes. They brought Kwon Bae-jun in at 12:43 p.m. Not from the airport. Seo Hyun's teams had intercepted him in the departure terminal's private lounge, which meant the extraction had been clean and quiet and conducted in a specific way that left no footage worth examining. He arrived in a black vehicle, in a room beneath the Choi estate that Zuri had not previously known existed. And he looked exactly like what he was. A brilliant man who had made one catastrophic miscalculation about who would be underestimated and who would not. He was younger than she'd expected. Late 30s. Slight build. The kind of face that belonged in lecture halls rather than underground pharmaceutical plants. His glasses were slightly bent, probably from the transit. He was straightening them when Seo Hyun walked in. Bae-jun looked up and went completely still because Choi Seo Hyun, who by every calculation should have been weeks away from irreversible, who should have been deteriorating, who should have been the leverage that brought an empire to its knees, was standing in front of him fully recovered, straight-backed, clear-eyed, carrying himself with the particular unhurried danger of a man who had nothing left to manage and everything left to settle. You look surprised, Seo Hyun said. Bae-jun said nothing. His eyes moved, a scientist's eyes, assessing, recalculating. They landed on Zuri, standing slightly behind and to the right of Seo Hyun. Stayed there. She watched him run the access sequence in his head. The biometric unit, the compound port, the chemical signature that had unlocked his carefully constructed secondary door. She watched the exact moment he understood. You, he said, quietly, with the specific disbelief of someone who had built a sophisticated trap and discovered it had been picked open by someone he hadn't accounted for at all. Me, Zuri said. He stared at her, then at Seo Hyun, then back at her. At the distance between them, which was not the distance of employer and staff, which was not any distance he'd built into his model of the Choi household, when he'd spent months designing this operation. I didn't account for you, he said, not an accusation, almost an admission, the involuntary honesty of a man whose scientific mind couldn't help acknowledging a variable he'd missed. Nobody does, she said. That's generally the point. Something flickered in his expression. In another context, it might have been respect. In this one, it was just the recognition of a mistake that had cost him everything. Seo Hyun pulled a chair out from the single table in the room, set it in front of Baejun with a sound that was quiet and final. "Sit down," he said. "We have things to discuss." He talked for 40 minutes. Not because he was broken. Kwon Baejun was not the kind of man who broke under physical pressure, and no physical pressure was applied. He talked because he was a scientist, and scientists, when their work was finally seen by someone capable of understanding it, had an almost biological compulsion to explain it fully. And because Zuri asked the right questions. Seo Hyun had not planned for her to lead the interrogation. She suspected he'd planned to conduct it himself, in the cold surgical way she'd seen him apply to every high-stakes exchange. But when Baejun went silent after the first direct question, shutting down the way people shut down when they felt confronted rather than understood, it was Zuri who spoke, not aggressively, not with the authority of the room behind her, just clearly, specifically, with the precise, technical fluency of someone who had spent 3 weeks reading everything available about sympathetic induction biology and compound reversal sequences, because that was what the situation had required. Baejun's eyes sharpened when she spoke. He answered. She learned the full scope of it in pieces. The Series 7 agent, 4 years in development, never published after the retraction, refined in secret using his brother, Dae-soo's funding, and his own genetic material. The sympathetic induction mechanism, not a clone exactly, but a parasitic tissue matrix that used the host cellular environment to sustain itself while replicating Baejun's own genetic signature. The intent had never been permanent harm. The intent had been humiliation, leverage, the Choi family brought to negotiating table, stripped of their heir's dignity, forced to acknowledge the Kwon faction as equals rather than subordinates. You wanted to be taken seriously, Zuri said. Baejun looked at her. My brother has spent 20 years being dismissed by your family's hierarchy. Every negotiation, every territorial discussion, treated as secondary. His voice was controlled, but something live moved beneath it. I gave him a weapon that required no violence, no casualties, just consequence. You put something inside me without my knowledge or consent, Seo Hyun said from across the room. His voice was quiet, which made it more dangerous than anything loud. And you call that no violence? Baejun had no answer for that. The mole in this household, Seo Hyun continued. My head of scheduling, who recruited him. My brother handled the operational side. I handled the science. Baejun said. Your brother, Seo Hyun said, who is currently where exactly? The pause that followed told Zuri everything. Kwon Dae-soo had not run. Kwon Dae-soo was not at an airport. He was somewhere he believed was safe, waiting for news of his brother's disappearance to determine his next move. Which meant Director Choi's appropriate channels were already in motion. She looked at Seo Hyun. He caught her eye across the room. A single brief exchange. The kind of communication that developed between people who had navigated something dangerous together, and come out the other side with a shared language that required no words. He gave the faintest nod. She stood. We have what we need, she said. Kwon Dae-soo was found at 3 p.m. in a private members club in the financial district. The kind of establishment that believed its discretion was absolute and discovered otherwise when Director Choi's men walked through the front door, with the particular ease of people who owned the concept of closed doors. Zuri was not in the room for that. She was in the estates, East Garden, when Seo Hyun found her. The small one, the narrow one, the one that was hers. The afternoon had turned gold and long-shadowed, and she was doing nothing in particular except existing in a space that had always let her do that. He sat on the stone bench. She stayed where she was. Dae-soo is cooperating, he said, fully. Apparently watching his younger brother dismantle 4 years of planning in 40 minutes with a maid asking questions was sufficiently motivating. Zuri said nothing. Let the information settle. He didn't know about the compound port, Seo Hyun continued. He didn't know Baejun had built a secondary access. He thought the only way in was biometric. Baejun's fingerprint. A pause. He thought the plan was airtight. It was airtight, Zuri said. For everyone they'd considered. Seo Hyun looked at her. He asked who you were, when they told him. He asked again. Couldn't accept that the answer was the same both times. She almost smiled. What did they tell him? The truth. Seo Hyun's voice was even. That you work here, that you found the evidence, That you ran the extraction and retrieved the antidote and conducted the interrogation. A pause. That you did all of it without anyone's permission or protection because you decided it needed doing. The garden was quiet. A bird somewhere in the estate's trees made a sound and then stopped. He said, Seo Hyun continued carefully, that if my family had people like you in visible positions, they would have far fewer problems. Zuri looked at him. And what did you say? I said we were aware of that now. She turned back to the garden, ran her fingers along the edge of the rosemary she'd planted in spring, dark green, woody-stemmed, stubbornly alive in soil that hadn't wanted to grow anything. What happens to Baejun, she said. That's above my authority to decide. A pause. But my father has agreed, at my request, that the science itself won't be destroyed. Baejun's research, properly applied, has legitimate medical potential. Supervised, controlled, stripped of what it became in his hands. Another pause, smaller. He'll work. Not freely, but he'll work. Zuri considered this. That's more generous than I expected. It's more pragmatic than generous. Seo Hyun's voice was dry. My father doesn't do generous. He does useful. She laughed, quietly, more than she'd intended. He looked at her when she laughed. Looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the sub-level floor, since the garden, since the study, with the full attention of a man who had spent months looking past her, and was now making up for it with an intensity that she was still learning to hold without looking away. Zuri. Yes, the position my father is creating. He paused. I want you to know it wasn't his idea. She kept her eyes on the rosemary. I know, you asked him to, yes. She finally looked up. I told you that last night, and you're not going to ask me why. I already know why. He looked at her steadily. The afternoon light was doing something specific to the garden, filling it with the kind of gold that made ordinary things look like they'd been chosen deliberately. The herbs, the stone bench, the narrow strip of soil she'd brought back from neglect. The man sitting in the middle of it who had once walked through her like she was air and was now looking at her like she was the only solid thing in the room. Because 14 months ago you lost something in this house, she said quietly, without knowing it, and you're trying to make sure you don't lose it again. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything they hadn't said directly, everything that had been communicated in glances and silences, and a hand extended on a concrete floor and taken without hesitation. Seo Hyun stood, crossed the small distance between the bench and where she was crouched. Stopped in front of her. She looked up at him. He reached down. Not to take her hand, just his fingers brushing the back of hers. Brief, deliberate. The most careful thing she'd ever seen him do. Stay, he said, simply, not as a command. Not the way he'd said move it in a corridor 14 months ago to a woman he hadn't seen, but as a question, from a person asking another person. Zuri looked at his hand near hers, at the garden around them, at the estate walls beyond it, which had been a boundary for so long and were now simply walls, structures, things that defined a space without controlling what grew inside it. She turned her hand over, let her fingers close around his. I'm already here, she said, and the garden held them both. Quietly, without ceremony, the way living things held everything they decided to keep.